Okay, so today you watched a video, or you're gonna watch a video on solving square roots. So this is lesson 2. You should have already done lesson 1. So if you need to find this, it's under the April 13th folder in your math folder under lesson 2, and it's solving square root equations practice. And this is the worksheet that I'm doing off of. So if you can't print like myself, I'm going to show you a way that you can do it. So if you click on the document, you could print that off, but in the directions it says solve each of the following equations on a separate sheet of paper for the positive value of x. If your answer is irrational, leave it in exact form. So I'm going to write if irrational, leave it in exact form. So what that means, and you should have watched this in the last videos, for example, the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 16 is 4. These are all exact answers. They end, it's exact. The square root of 4 is 2 and the square root of 16 is 4. However, if you have something like the square root of 3, the square root of 3, if I do that in my calculator, is a long number that never ends and never repeats, so we can call that irrational. So to leave this in exact form is just to leave it as the square root of 3, because anybody can type this in their calculator and they can actually see what the value is, but as soon as we round this value, it's not exact anymore. So if you get an answer where you can't take something the square root of it nicely, then you just leave it. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to do questions numbers 1, 4, 7, and 10. So kind of down that first column. And if you scroll to the bottom of there's extra practice. That's not mandatory, but if you're feeling like, hey, I could use some more practice with this, you can totally do those problems as well. So problem number 1 says x squared equals 36. And this is probably the most simple example because it's an equation. So I see x squared. I know that the opposite of squaring something is taking the square root of something. So if I square root both sides, I get x equals, and I'm going to check my calculator. If you don't know your perfect squares, always check it. The square root of 36 is 6. So I can say that x is equal to 6 because the square root of x squared is x and the square root of 36 is 6. So I can, number 1, that's easy. It's simple. I can just do it like that. So this is how you might do it in your notebook. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to write down what number, the equation, and then you can just solve it. Okay? So now if I do number 4, I'm going to write down the equation for number 4. So it says x squared equals 1.96. So again, I see x squared. That means, okay, in order to undo an x squared, I got to square root. Whatever I do to one side, I got to do it to the other. The square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 1.96, I'm going to do it in my calculator. So the square root button is right over that x squared button, so second x squared, and you're going to do 1.96. And it should give you a nice rounded 1.4. So this is an exact number. We didn't have to play with it. It's exactly 1.4. Okay, so that's number 1 and that's number 4. So now we're going to get something a little more complicated. So for example, number 7 says x squared plus 20 equals 93. Okay, and so with this one, this one might help you to build the wall. If you want to get x by itself, the first thing you got to do is you got to get this x squared by itself so you can then take the square root like we did up here. So I have to undo this 20. To undo this 20, I'm going to subtract 20 from both sides. And I get, that cancels out. I get x squared is left on this side. And then 93 minus 20 is 73. Okay, and now that I have x squared alone, it becomes just like this problem. Now I can just take the square root of both sides. And I get x is equal to, if I do the square root of 73, I get an irrational number. So I'm actually going to leave it x is the square root of 73. And I'll be done with it. Okay, because anybody can type this in the calculator and know what it is. They just got to know to take the square root of that number. Okay? And finally, the last one I'm going to talk about is number 10 on this list. So number 10 says 50x squared equals 300. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do you see how that 50 is attached to the x squared? They're being multiplied together. So to get rid of that 50, I got to divide by 50 on both sides. So when I do that, I get x squared, which is a good sign. And then I can do 300 divided by 50. I get 6. And my last step is to undo the squared. So I'm going to take the square root. And I get x equals, if you take the square root of 6, that's an irrational number. So I'm going to leave it the square root of 6. So anytime it tells you to leave your answer in exact form, you're going to leave it with the square root if it's irrational. Or if it's nice, you just leave it as a nice number. If it told you to round, you would take the square root of 6 like this. And you would just round to, say it rounded to the nearest tenth, you would say, okay, this is 2.4. Okay, so it kind of depends what the direction says. Make sure you follow the directions. But that's how you solve squared equations. And this is like the basis of what we're going to do for the whole unit. So if you can do 1 through 12 on this page, you're going to be in really good shape. If you're not sure, make sure you go with office hours or ask your teacher for help.